Good morning. I'm glad you could be with me today in our Unfolding the Word series. As you know, we're in the midst of Daniel, and we've been looking at chapter 2 of Daniel, which introduces us to a dream that God sent to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonian Empire. This dream was a dream to affirm that God is the Lord of history, that history unfolds according to his plan, his purposes, and that he is over all nations, and that he puts nations in place and removes them according to his purpose and plan. And of course, ultimately, that all human nations will eventually be done away with, and the ruling final kingdom will be his kingdom, the kingdom of his Son, the Messiah. I'm going to pick up our reading today in verse 39. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all of the earth. We've talked about the fact that in this dream, the image, the statue, this awe-inspiring and fearful statue, represented these human kingdoms. It represented what will occur over timeline of history as God allows certain nations to become the dominant nations of a region. And he looks specifically at those nations that ultimately influence the nature of the life of the Jews. He begins with this nation, this golden head that is Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar as the king of Babylon. We discussed how all of this image underscores for us that while the world looks at the image of human kingdoms as powerful and fearful and awe-inspiring, God looks at them from a very different vantage point. They're all transitory, all ultimately under his control, and all will be eventually replaced with the kingdom of the rock, the Messiah. We ended yesterday by looking at the golden head, which was clearly Nebuchadnezzar. He says, "You are the head of gold." All the kingdoms that followed Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian Empire were inferior kingdoms. They did not achieve what Babylon had achieved, yet they were more powerful as time went on. One of the results of that, by the way, is that Babylon remained sort of a mystique, that the nations that followed kind of looked back to Babylon and wanted to inherit what Babylon had and never were able to completely. Well, the golden head, Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar finding in no uncertain terms that his goals and aspirations, that his kingdom would last forever, weren't going to be realized. That his kingdom had a purpose in the plan of God, but God was the Lord of history, and he determines how history unfolds. Well, the second of the kingdoms that are identified in this image for us today is in verse 39. We're introduced to it, and it's talking about the silver arms and chest. The second of these vast kingdoms influencing the world, influencing the Jewish people, was the Medo-Persian Empire. It was the empire that defeated Babylon and took over the region in 539 BC. You remember, Babylon only lasted a short time following the death of Nebuchadnezzar. It was a powerful kingdom, turned out to be larger in terms of the scope of the kingdom than the Babylonian Empire had been, encompassed more geographic regions, more nations. Cyrus the Great was the one who brought that empire into its heyday. He was the one in charge when Babylon itself was defeated. But Cyrus the Great only lived for 10 years following the development of that empire. After his death, another major player was on the scene, Darius the Great, and he expanded the kingdom of the Medo-Persian Empire to its greatest extent. He was followed later by Xerxes. Xerxes was the ruler of the Medo-Persian Empire at the time of Esther, the book of Esther in the scriptures. Later, Xerxes was followed by Artaxerxes. And Artaxerxes was the ruler of the Medo-Persian Empire at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. In other words, the Medo-Persian Empire intersects the scriptures at a number of points in the post-exilic period. And therefore, again, remember each of these kingdoms that's being identified by God, besides being an empire, is influencing the Israelite people in a very real and significant manner. Well, the Medo-Persian Empire, this silver arms and chest, ended up ruling over a larger region than the Babylonians. But they were never able to produce the same results. They never quite reached the level of civilization and accomplishment that Babylon, the Neo-Chaldean Empire, was able to achieve. Ultimately, the Medo-Persian Empire was really a loose confederation in a sense. They actually had 4 different capital cities spread over different parts of the regions. In a way, the empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, was more like a collection of loose allies. Babylon, everything was under the control of Nebuchadnezzar, and Babylon is the capital. But the Medo-Persian Empire was different in its structure, different in its nature. Never able quite to be what Babylon was able to be. So remember our principle. God's unfolding for us Gentile history, the history of the nations, and saying, from the head of gold, things deteriorated even though they were larger and more powerful. They were not quite the achievement that the previous one had been. The Medo-Persian Empire lasted for 200 years, much longer than the Babylonian Empire. But eventually, the Medo-Persian Empire was defeated by Alexander the Great in the Macedonian or Greek Empire that occurred under his leadership and under his control. And that empire, which replaces the silver arms and chest, is what is being referred to in the dream as the bronze belly and thighs. The kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all of the earth. The empire that emerged under Alexander the Great was a more powerful kingdom than the Babylonian Empire. In 330 BC, it took over the known world. It controlled a much larger region. But really, despite its expansion, unprecedented expansion, by the way, but despite its expansion, it was never able to be what the Medo-Persian Empire had been or previously had reached the heights of Babylon. In terms of the Greek culture, the golden age of the Greeks, the time of the great philosophers, actually preceded the development of the Greek Empire under Alexander. So even though the empire grew and expanded, it was not producing the kinds of benefits for humanity that had been achieved earlier in its history. At any rate, this Babylonian or this Greek Empire under Alexander the Great spread from Europe into the Middle East and expanded actually even to the borders of modern-day India and Pakistan. Alexander the Great actually intended, according to historical records, to make the capital of his greatly expanded empire Babylon itself. Remember the mystique of Babylon? He intended that to be his capital city. He wanted to inherit what had been achieved by the Golden Head, Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. But even though he intended this, and even though he was in Babylon to begin that process of making it his capital, that's where Alexander died at a young age. And so he was never able to achieve the capital city of Babylon as he had intended. At his death, the Greek Empire, this empire of bronze, broke into 4 sub-empires. And these empires continued to fight one another and to influence the region in which the Holy Land is found. And so the continuing effects of the Bronze Kingdom were there over the Jews and over the Holy Land for another period of 200 years. And yet, Alexander, of course, wasn't. The Greek Empire, the remains of it, these four component pieces that it broke into following Alexander's death, eventually is destroyed, just as the dream indicates to us, and is replaced by an empire of iron. And that's exactly what happened as the Greek Empire and the remains of that Greek Empire ultimately were destroyed by Rome in the developing Roman Empire. In 63 BC, Rome took over the region of the Holy Land and now became the dominant empire overseeing the Holy Land and overseeing the Jews. Alexander's empire lasted longer than the Medo-Persian Empire by another 50 years. But Rome comes on the scene in God's plan of unfolding history. Join me tomorrow as we learn more about the empire of iron that God identifies for us here in the dream of Daniel chapter 2.